Hi class, welcome to lecture 3, part B. Where we left off, we were talking about different political scientists and philosophers' beliefs and how they intertwined with liberalism. We talked about Immanuel Kant. We're going to continue that on with our next political scientist, and that is Francis Fukuyama. He was born in 1952, and he is still alive. Now, Fukuyama wrote one of the most controversial and important books in liberalism in 1989 called The End of History and the Last Man. Basically, what he's saying, and you have to put this in the context of when he wrote it, 1989. That was right when the Soviet Union was collapsing, right? So he says, after the Cold War, the end of history began. And it doesn't mean obviously history is done, but he does have a specific meaning for that. Essentially, he's saying liberalism, United States kind of classical liberalism has won out, right? So basically what we're talking about now, liberalism is the after the collapse of the Soviet Union, is the dominating world ideology, okay? After the Soviet Union collapsed, you remember, during the Cold War, there was two major powers. There was a bipolar system. You had the United States and you had the USSR, and they were engaged in an arm race. They were very competitive with each other, essentially vying to be the most powerful country in the world. They had no trust in each other whatsoever. They're stockpiling nuclear weapons. They both had enough weapons to blow up the world 100 times over. A very tense time. But the Soviet Union fails because of horrible economic policies, bad fiscal responsibility, bad international policy, etc. Essentially, the Soviet Union collapsed from within, with some help, of course, from their rival, the United States. So Francis Fukuyama looks at the collapse of communism, really the last kind of hope for communism, the communist dream, and says, okay, well, that failed. We've seen fascism fail in World War II. We've seen communism fail over and over again. So what's left? What prevailing ideology is there? And he looks at it, he says, the only ideology that's successful still is liberalism. The United States uses liberalism, right? We're a free market economy, kind of classic liberalism, free market economy, international trade, open markets, etc. Right? Big value on rights and liberties. So he says, with the end of the Cold War, we've experienced a victory of economic and political liberalism, right? The tenets I just described. Western culture has prevailed supreme, has won over communism and all other ideologies. And he says that we're witnessing the end of an ideological revolution that was communism and the universalization of Western liberal democracy. So this is a very big claim. He's not only claiming that communism didn't work, which it didn't, of course, but that Western liberalism, both political and economic, and we talked about the tenets in part A of this lecture, if you want to go back and view it, has won out. It's spreading, and it's the only viable system left on this planet, essentially. Now, he does acknowledge past challenges to liberalism, communism probably being the biggest, and of course, fascism in Germany, etc., and Italy. But he's saying they have failed. Fascism failed in Italy and Germany at the end of World War II. Communism failed in every country it's ever been tried. So he's saying there's really no way to look at it other than classical liberalism is the surviving and the best ideology in existence so far. Okay, and even he points out, I should say, that even by the end of the Soviet Union's collapse, they had become more open. They become more liberal, right? You have the glasnost and perestroika, the freeing of information, the opening up of the markets. They became more liberal. He would point to a country like China, which is historically communist. If you look at their rise, you can see that when they were strictly communist under Chairman Mao, their economy and their politics were terrible, right? It's estimated that somewhere around 50 million people starved to death under Chairman Mao's terrible economic Great Leap Forward policies, right? But when he died, they began to open up their markets and they become more and more successful. So while they're still communist in name, he might point out that in reality, they become more and more liberal. And he might say, and other liberalists might say, the more liberal a country becomes economically and politically, the more successful that they end up. We've also seen liberalism spread through countries, including Japan, South Korea, etc. And he actually makes a prediction of democratization in China as younger generations grow old. How is that prediction turning out now? Not good, right? China, if anything, has become more and more authoritarian. Now, modernization theory would have you believe that economic political success are tied in with liberalization. Perhaps that's not the key, but only history will tell. So he says, again, liberalism has prevailed, all other ideologies have failed, but he does acknowledge there is room for challenges and problems to liberalism. And he points out two: religion and nationalism. And I think he might have nailed these, right? This might be very fortuitous of him. I don't know if fortuitous is the right word, a very good prediction of his, right? He says religion and nationalism could potentially challenge liberalism in the future. If we look at life in 2021, we're seeing religious extremism, right? We're seeing that in the Middle East take over our attempts to implement liberal democracies. And we're seeing rises of nationalism in some countries, including the United States, right? And including some European countries, we're seeing this rising sense of nationalism. So it'd be interesting to see if his predictions come true and these threaten the liberal world order we've kind of come to know. Our next political scientist, Joseph Nye. Nye wrote in 1990, Bound to Lead, The Changing Nature of Power, a very important piece in its own right. Essentially, he has a very interesting definition of power, which I think is pretty good. It's basically the ability to get others to do what you want or not do what you don't want, right? And he says there's three ways to do this. One, coerce them with threats, say do it or else. Two, induce them with payments, say, hey, do this, we'll give you money. And three, attract and co-opt them to want what you want. And this is kind of the main point here. Number three, get people to want what you want, right? Let's talk a little bit more about that, right? So he calls this soft power, this ability to get people to think how you think. Soft power is a very interesting concept. Essentially, it's saying that the more other states think like you think, are similar to you, the more likely they are to agree with you and go along with what you want. We might also call soft power cultural influence or indirect power, okay? So essentially what we're saying here is that cultural influence can be a very important type of power. Think about the United States, for example. If you can almost go to any country in the world and go to a McDonald's, there might be a few different menu tweaks, and some of them are really interesting. But you can go to Starbucks, McDonald's, in basically any country in the world. You can go to any country and you'll probably find someone who speaks English. This is what we call soft power, right? Our movies and our music, it makes countries who are consuming our media, who are speaking the language we generally speak in this country, more like us, right? And he would say, and I would say, if they're more like you, they're probably more willing to negotiate and see things as you see things. So this can be an important indicator of power, getting people to behave as you behave, right? And I don't think soft power can be discounted. I think it's a very, very real thing. And ultimately, again, this is kind of a tenet of realism. And I would say that once states, through their soft power, get other states to become more like them, it will make conflict less likely, right? Again, to go back to what I said earlier, you're less likely to have a conflict with someone who is similar to you than you are with someone who's very different to you. So as you accept the same kind of sense of ideals and morality, perhaps, you're less likely to go to war or have conflict with another nation. So soft power, very interesting concept. Okay, so let's close out here and talk about liberalism and globalization. So globalization, as the world becomes a smaller place, right, through technology, communication is of extreme importance. And those who believe in liberalism, liberals really welcome globalization because it can make their ultimate, let's say, goal or thesis that international peace is possible, it can make it more realistic, right? In the days of the USA and the USSR in the Cold War, they had a phone in the Oval Office that had a direct line to the Kremlin. right? Because they recognized the importance of communication in the event that there was some kind of nuclear accident, right? And now we can talk to anyone in the world at any time, essentially. And that communication is, again, going to make us more similar, but also perhaps dissolve some of the misunderstandings we would have had before we had the technology to communicate with other people. We talked about democratic peace theory. I want to focus on some of the criticisms of liberalism. We talked about in our last lecture some of the critiques of realism. Let's poke some holes in liberalism, because I think it's important to balance out each of these theories and realize that they are just theories and that no theory is perfectly going to describe the world as we know it, right? So one criticism is of democratic peace theory. It can be seen as imperialistic, especially Republican liberalism, right? That if we enter other countries to try to force them to be democratic, does that really work? I mean, if it does, theoretically, it could create peace because democracies don't fight each other, but does it really work? I mean, look at Vietnam, right? We invaded South Vietnam to prevent them from becoming communist, right? Prevent the Northern Vietnam from claiming their territory. We thought they had ties to USSR. How did that work out? How did the war in Afghanistan and Iraq work out? Going into a foreign country and implementing liberal democracy is very, very hard. And it's a lesson we've learned over and over again, right? So sometimes democratic peace theory is seen as being overzealous or imperialistic, again, especially the type of Republican liberalism. Another criticism of liberalism and democratic peace theory is, how do you define democracies, right? No country is 100% democratic or in 0% authoritarian and vice versa, or they're all a mix, right? Different countries are different levels of democratic elements. So some people criticize democratic peace theory as just cherry picking and saying, okay, you're only choosing democracies that fit into your definition of democracies. Where do you really draw the lines? Because most countries in the world have at least some democratic elements, and those countries sometimes do go to war with one another. So here are some critiques that realists might lobby at liberalists. Some people say liberalism is too optimistic. Peace is not achievable, they would say. There's no international government. Realists might say, how can you know that international peace is achievable? It hasn't been achieved yet, and we have the UN, we have the League of Nations. It's too optimistic of a theory. Hans Morgenthau, a prominent realist, has a good quote. He says about liberalism, you have misunderstood politics because you have misestimated human nature. So he's saying, again, it goes back to human nature, it goes back to Hobbes and Locke. He's saying that human nature is anarchy, right? You've misunderestimated how individuals act, and therefore you've misunderestimated how different states act in the international system. I think that's a very condemning critique. Also, another critique is a historical critique. Not all of liberalism tenets have proved to be correct in the past, right? We look to World War II. After World War I, we created something called the League of Nations internationally. The US ended up, despite being a big player in creating it, ended up not joining it on a vote by Congress. But the League of Nations did nothing to stop World War II, right? We had this group of nations got together to prevent a tragedy like World War I, a war for almost nothing. And yet, 20 years later, less than 25 years later, we break out into the biggest war the world's ever seen. So realists might say, how did international cooperation stop the war? It didn't. So therefore, maybe it's problematic. Also, and this is probably the biggest critique that you'll see lobbied at liberalists, is there's no international government. The UN, it doesn't bind its members. If you disobey the UN, if you're a strong enough country, nothing's going to happen, right? So a good example of this is the US, when it wanted to invade Iraq, it asked approval from the UN and it got denied. And what did the US do? It did it anyways. Why? Because the US is the most powerful country in the world, right? The realists would say might is right. The US is going to do what it wants. The UN can't stop it. Therefore, it's kind of a sham government. They would say there is no international government. To think the UN is an international government is foolish, because if a country like the US wants to do something, who's going to stop them? So we're going to skip that one. Another critique: economic interdependence does not prevent war. International banking has been around for centuries, and we've seen multiple world wars. We've seen, despite the fact that there was a lot of trade going on in World War II, before World War II, we still got involved in a major war, right? So you can look at points in history that despite the fact that countries did regularly trade, they still ended up breaking into a war. So that's going to conclude lecture 3, part B. Thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions, of course, you can feel free to message me on Canvas or email me. Thank you for tuning in, and I will speak to you guys soon.